The door was open. That was the first thing. Not the smell, not the sound, not the way the air pressed against the inside of my chest like water in a sealed container. The door. Enclosure 7. Heavy reinforced steel with a hydraulic seal that required a manual override and a key card. Standing wide open at 2 in the morning with no alarm, no alert, no explanation. I stopped walking. The hum in the concrete, that constant low-frequency current that had been vibrating through the soles of my boots since I arrived, rose slightly. Not louder, deeper. Like something had shifted one gear lower and was now running at a different weight. I could smell it before I looked inside, antiseptic and metal, and underneath that something sweet and warm, like a circuit board reaching the edge of its tolerance. The air tasted pressurized, and the way it always did in this place, that sensation of lungs that couldn't quite empty all the way. Breath that never fully finished. I looked inside. Every one of them was facing me. Not one or two. All of them. Across 7, across 6, across 5 and 4, and every enclosure I could see the length of that corridor. Every shape behind every pane of reinforced glass had rotated or turned or shifted and was now oriented precisely, perfectly toward me. Different anatomies, different sizes, things with eyes and things without them. All of them aimed. Then Dale Kincaid's voice came from inside enclosure 7. Calm, conversational, the exact cadence I'd heard from him earlier that shift. "Step inside, Russell. Lock the door behind you." I looked at the intercom panel beside the door. The light was off, the intercom was dead, and the voice wasn't coming from the speaker. It was coming from inside the enclosure, from the back wall, from the air itself, from somewhere I couldn't locate because it was coming from everywhere at once. I stepped back. They all stepped forward, every single one, same foot, same distance, same time. I need to go back to how I ended up there. My name is Russell Dean Holloway. I've been a facility systems contractor for 11 years, specializing in remote installations, redundant containment infrastructure, and what the paperwork usually calls non-standard operational environments. I've worked oil platforms, deep storage facilities, 2 decommissioned government research sites, and one place in the Nevada desert I'm still not allowed to describe in writing. I'm not easily unsettled. That's not a boast. It's a professional qualification. A Blackridge Zoological Annex hired me through a third-party agency on a short-term contract. The listing described the work as routine maintenance assessment for a wildlife quarantine facility. 12 miles outside the town of Klamath Falls, Oregon, accessed by a county road that wasn't on any public map I could find. The agency contact told me the facility housed sensitive biological research subjects and that the short-term engagement was standard for their contractor rotation. I remember reading that phrase, contractor rotation. I didn't understand what it meant yet. I drove in on a Tuesday evening in early November, the kind of Pacific Northwest dark that arrives early and settles completely, no gradual fade, just light then dark. In the forest pressing right up to the edge of the access road, with no margin between the tree line and the gravel. The facility appeared ahead as a low, wide concrete structure, mostly single-story, with the kind of exterior lighting that illuminates buildings without illuminating their surroundings. Everything visible, nothing beyond visible. A fence line I couldn't see the extent of. What I noticed first was the quiet, not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. 12 miles into Oregon forest in November you hear things. Wind at minimum, birds settling for the night, insects at the edge of audibility. The small constant noise of a living ecosystem doing what living ecosystems do. There was none of that. The forest around Blackridge Zoological Annex was silent in the way that rooms are silent, not in the way that outdoors is silent, as if whatever normally occupied that acoustic space had simply decided not to be there. The only sound was the hum. I felt it before I heard it. Through the soles of my boots as I stepped out of my truck, a low vibration in the concrete of the parking apron, steady and consistent like a generator running somewhere deep in the structure. Not unpleasant exactly, the kind of thing you'd stop noticing after an hour. I noticed it. Colleen Maris Whitaker met me at the exterior entry. Facility director. She had the bearing of someone who had explained the rules so many times they no longer contained any information for her, only process. She was efficient and direct, and she shook my hand once and then handed me a laminated card before I'd said anything beyond my name. "These are the operational protocols," she said. "You know, they're not suggestions and they're not approximations. You follow them exactly as written." I read the card while she watched. 4 rules. Clean, plainly worded. Never open more than one enclosure door at a time. If an animal mimics human speech, report it and leave the area immediately. Maintain eye contact only when performing scheduled observation. All feeding through designated ports. No entry into enclosures under any circumstances. I remember thinking they read like someone had anticipated every specific way this job could go wrong. "What are we housing here?" I asked. "Research subjects," she said. "The specifics aren't part of your scope. Your scope is systems assessment. Cameras, door mechanisms, ventilation cycling, pressure regulation. You'll work the night rotation with our senior keeper." She paused at the interior door and looked at me with the particular quality of attention I've since come to recognize as the look of someone deciding how much of a thing to say. "Don't let the quiet bother you," she said. "You'll get used to it." She went back inside before I could ask what she meant. I didn't get used to it. The inside of Black Ridge looked nothing like any zoo or research facility I'd worked in before. Not because the equipment was unusual, it wasn't. Standard ventilation, standard monitoring systems, standard reinforced enclosure architecture. What was unusual was the arrangement. The enclosures were laid out in a precise geometric grid. Perfect parallel lines, perfect right angles. Measured with an exactness that felt less like efficient use of space and more like intention. The kind of layout you'd see in diagrams of distributed networks. Nodes arranged to maximize communication efficiency. I'd seen that layout in data centers, never in animal facilities. I noticed the cameras about 20 minutes into my walkthrough. Not that they were there. I expected cameras. What I noticed was how they moved. I was standing at the junction of 2 corridors, reading a pressure gauge, and I caught the motion of one repositioning in my peripheral vision. Not tracking my movement. That's what surveillance cameras do, they follow you. This one repositioned before I moved, the way you'd turn to look at something you already knew was about to happen. I filed it mentally as a calibration anomaly. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet. Trent Alonzo Mercer was waiting for me at the start of the night rotation, leaning against a corridor wall with the specific stillness of someone who had been very still in that place for a very long time. He was the senior keeper. He'd been at Black Ridge for 4 years. He looked like someone who had been at Black Ridge for much longer. "First rotation?" he asked. "First at this facility," I said. He nodded at that without surprise and handed me a secondary set of monitoring records and didn't say anything else for a while. We moved through the first feeding circuit together and I watched him work. He was methodical, precise. He used the designated ports exactly as the protocol specified, never standing directly in front of an enclosure longer than he had to, or never pausing to look in unless the scheduled observation window required it. He wasn't afraid exactly. He was measured in the way that people are measured when they've learned the cost of being otherwise. I was 3 enclosures into the circuit when I noticed the movement. Enclosure 3 contained something quadrupedal, low and wide, covered in what appeared to be a dense, uniform gray material that my eyes kept wanting to resolve as fur and kept failing to. Enclosure 8, which I could see diagonally across the junction, held something I hadn't gotten a clear look at yet. Taller, different body plan entirely, something that moved along the upper rim of its space in a way that my proprioception didn't enjoy watching. They were both moving in exactly the same pattern, not similar, identical. Left 3 steps, pause, weight shift right, pause, quarter turn, pause. Different limbs, different anatomies, different physical capabilities executing the same sequence at the same moment in the same rhythm. I stopped walking. "Don't stop," Trent said without looking at me. I started walking again. "Are they always like this?" "Like what?" "The movement, the synchronization." He said nothing for a moment. We reached the next feeding port and he completed the sequence and said very quietly, "Don't let them sync up." "What does that mean?" He picked up the monitoring log and moved to the next station. "It means don't let them sync up." That was when I heard the tapping. From enclosure 3, the same quadrupedal shape now still in the center of its space. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the reinforced glass, steady and measured. And the exact rhythm of my footsteps. I kept walking. The tapping continued, perfectly matched, step for step. I slowed experimentally, the tapping slowed. I sped up slightly, the tapping sped up. Then, because I had to know, I stopped. The tapping stopped. I held completely still. I held my breath. The silence lasted exactly as long as I held it. The moment I exhaled, the tapping resumed. Soft, patient, precise. Like a finger on glass. Like something marking time. Like something that had learned what rhythm meant and was now demonstrating that it knew. Trent was watching me from the next junction. His expression hadn't changed. "Does it feel like it's watching from inside you yet?" he asked. I didn't answer that. I didn't know what to say. I've gone back to that question in the months since. I've turned it over and over, the phrasing, the timing, why he asked it in that moment, what he already knew when he asked it. I didn't have answers then. I'm not sure I have complete answers now. That detail seemed minor. I have thought about it every single day since. I found the maintenance locker during an equipment check in the second hour of the rotation. Oliver Bryce Hensley, the facility maintenance tech, had mentioned in the shift handoff notes that Locker 7 in the East Corridor had a sticky latch and might not be fully secured. He was right. It was standing open when I reached it, and inside, next to the circuit diagrams and the spare relay components, was a folded piece of notebook paper that had been tucked into the manual binder with no label, no date, no name. I unfolded it. Handwriting. 3 rules written in a cramped but deliberate hand. If they speak, I answer them once. Ignoring them makes it worse. Open 2 doors if they start moving together. It breaks the pattern. Do not trust the cameras. They lag when it matters. I stood there in the locker room with the paper in my hands and the hum of the concrete moving up through my boots and the antiseptic metal sweet smell of the facility in the back of my throat, and I read all 3 of those rules twice. They were not Colleen's rules. Her rules were about containment, about maintaining distance, about reporting and leaving. These 3 rules were about engaging, about responding, about intervening in specific ways that the official rules explicitly prohibited. Someone had been here before me. Someone who had spent enough time at Blackridge to write a different set of instructions. Someone who had learned something the official protocol didn't account for. Someone who had not left their name. I thought about the official rule. If an animal mimics human speech, report it and leave the area immediately. I thought about the handwritten rule. Answer them once. Ignoring them makes it worse. Worse how? Worse for who? I folded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket and walked back toward the main corridor. I was going to test it. I'm a contractor. Testing anomalies is what I do. I know that sounds thin saying it now, But I was 11 years into this work, and I had a very strong professional instinct that the official rules and the unofficial rules were in direct, deliberate contradiction, and I wanted to understand why. That curiosity, that specific professional instinct to find the fault in the system, is probably what got me through the night. It's also, I understand now, exactly what the system was designed to trigger. I walked to the enclosure at the far end of the east corridor, the one I hadn't been briefed on, the one with no marking on the exterior beyond a serial number and a maintenance tag. And I waited. It didn't take long. Russell. My name. From inside. Quiet. Conversational. The voice of someone speaking through a door rather than a containment wall. Not Dale Kincaid this time. No voice I recognized. Just my name, stated plainly, the way you'd say it to get someone's attention in an ordinary room. I opened my mouth. Yes, I said. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I'd ever heard in that facility. Not the low, constant absence of outside noise, an active silence, dense and immediate, like a held breath across the entire building. The hum in the floor didn't stop, but it dropped in frequency, lower, slower, as if something had downshifted. The tapping didn't resume. The movement stopped. For the first time since I'd arrived, Black Ridge felt still. Not calm. Still. The way a power line is still until it isn't. I stood there in that stillness and felt something I can only describe as stability, a false stability, the feeling of a machine running at reduced load, and I thought, the official rules are keeping this active. Breaking them is what interrupts it. I was right about that. I was also completely, catastrophically wrong about what it meant. The corridor I'd been avoiding for 2 hours was marked on the facility map as the primary containment passage. In a long, straight run from the East Service Hub to the Central Junction, lined on both sides with larger enclosures, heavier construction, reinforced glass that was thicker than anywhere else I'd worked. The pressure in that corridor was different even before I entered it. My ears registered the change the moment I pushed through the fire door. The hum was louder here, not just in the floor, in the walls, the ceiling, the air itself. A frequency that sat just below the threshold of sound and well above the threshold of physical sensation. I felt it in my back teeth, and the doors were open. Not one, not two. Every enclosure door along the left side of the passage, 6 in total, standing open by roughly 2 feet each, the hydraulic seals disengaged, the latches in their unlocked position. Not broken, not forced. Opened correctly and deliberately. I stopped at the entrance of the corridor and looked the length of it. The entities were out of the corners of their spaces and at the thresholds. Not outside, not in the passage. But at the open doors, occupying the 2 feet of space between their environments and mine. And they were all in the same posture. Weight forward, whatever they used for that. Oriented in the same direction. Facing not toward me, but slightly past me at an angle I had to consciously work out, an angle that, if extended, would converge on a single point somewhere behind the door I'd just come through. They weren't looking at me. They were looking towards something that didn't have a location yet. And then they began to move, slowly, not toward the passage, laterally, as if each entity in its own enclosure, I was adjusting its position within its own space to maintain a specific spatial relationship with the others. A few degrees left, a half step forward. The smallest fractional adjustments, constant, continuous, the way musicians in an ensemble make micro-corrections to stay aligned. The hum shifted. Its frequency rose by something I felt before I could measure it. And for a moment, standing at the entrance to that corridor, I had the overwhelming physical sensation of something assembling itself not in front of me, not around me, but across the entire space I was standing inside. They were trying to connect. I understood that the way you understand something your body tells you before your mind processes it. The geometry of the enclosures, the precise grid Colleen had built this place around, was not designed for efficient use of space. It was a topology, a spatial arrangement that maintained specific distances between specific nodes to prevent a specific kind of relationship from completing. I backed out of the corridor. I was still thinking about the handwritten rule. Open two doors if they start moving together. It breaks the pattern. I hadn't understood it. Now I thought I did. Except what I thought I understood and what was actually happening were two different things, and I wouldn't know that until later, when it was already too late to matter. The lockdown started at 3:30. I know it was 3:30 because I had just checked the pressure log in the West Service Hub, and the timestamp was on the page when Colleen's voice came through the facility intercom. Flat and procedural, the voice of someone executing a planned sequence. Initiating full containment lockdown. All personnel to secure positions. The doors began closing. Not the enclosure doors. Every door. Fire doors, corridor doors, junction barriers, the entire internal partition system engaging in a rolling sequence from the facility perimeter inward. I could hear it through the walls. Heavy hydraulics. The sound of a large structure sealing itself into components. I was in a sealed segment of the west corridor when the enclosures nearest me responded. Not by calming down, by accelerating. The entities in the three enclosures I could see through the corridor glass went from the slow, coordinated drift of alignment to something faster and more aggressive. A churning, urgent motion, still synchronized, still perfectly mirrored, but with a quality that registered in my chest as alarm. As if the lockdown had not interrupted them, but had introduced a new and urgent variable into their coordination. As if human control attempts felt to them like stimulation. I pressed my back against the corridor wall and watched and understood something that should have been obvious from the moment I read Colleen's rules. The rules weren't designed to protect the staff from the entities. The rules were designed to produce specific, predictable human behaviors. Report and leave. Maintain eye contact only on schedule. One door at a time. Designated ports only. Every rule generated a specific, repeatable action pattern from any human following it. Every action pattern was observable. Every observable pattern could be cataloged. The handwritten rules produced different behaviors, unpredictable ones, responses that broke the established pattern. The official rules were the primary data set. The handwritten rules were an attempt by someone to introduce noise into the collection. And I had done both. In the same night, I had followed official protocol and triggered synchronized movement. I had followed unofficial protocol and interrupted it. I had given this system two distinct behavioral data points from a single human subject inside a single rotation, and the lockdown was amplifying everything because it added a third variable. External control attempt, human response to containment. The intelligence, if that's what to call it, wasn't being studied. It was studying. I'm going to take a breath here. The next part is the part I've had to tell myself in pieces because the full shape of it doesn't fit comfortably inside a single thought. And there were archived logs, a filing cabinet in the West Service Hub accessible because I had a maintenance clearance key labeled with a year range that started 43 years before my arrival. I found them because the lockdown had me stationary in that hub for 20 minutes with nothing to do but look at my surroundings. Every log file had a contractor designation, dates, shift times, observational notes, escalation records. I skimmed them. The earlier ones were detailed and orderly. Thorough professional documentation. They grew shorter as the rotation progressed, each single night's record, a different name, a different set of initial observations and responses. They all ended mid-sentence. Not everyone ended at the same point in the night, but when I compared the timestamps of the last entries across multiple files, they clustered. They clustered at roughly the same threshold. Different contractors, different years, different observational approaches, all of them reaching the same moment in the escalation pattern and then stopping. Their sentence unfinished, their thought incomplete. Each of them had lasted exactly one rotation. The facility was hiring contractors on short-term rotation. Not because that was efficient for systems maintenance. Not because the work was short-term. Because they needed a fresh data point. A new human with no prior exposure to Blackridge's behavioral patterns responding to the facility's protocols for the first time. Processing the rules for the first time. Developing their own strategy for the first time. The intelligence didn't need them to survive. It needed to watch them figure it out. In the study wasn't, what do these creatures do? The study was, what does this human do when they encounter something they don't understand and have to make decisions with incomplete information? And I had been spectacular at it, exactly what it needed. I'd followed the official rules and documented my compliance. I'd found the unofficial rules and tested them with genuine professional curiosity. I'd observed the synchronization and drawn my own conclusions and acted on those conclusions and deviated from both sets of instructions at different points in the rotation, giving the system behavioral data it hadn't collected before. My unpredictability hadn't disrupted the system, it had evolved it. That was the moment I ran. Not because running made strategic sense. It didn't. The corridor was still locked down. I couldn't get to an exit. And I ran because my body made that decision before my mind finished processing the implication, which is, I think, exactly the kind of decision the intelligence had never collected before. Pure panic response from a subject who had just understood what they were inside. I made it 40 feet down the west corridor before I heard them sink. Not the slow assembly of before. This was immediate, complete. Every enclosure on the west corridor falling into the same sound at the same moment. A unified low resonance that I felt in the soles of my feet and the backs of my eyes simultaneously. The hum that had been in the concrete the entire time rose and became something else. A frequency that was not electrical, not mechanical, something that had been using the concrete as a conductor. I stopped running, not by choice. My legs stopped. Not paralysis, why more like the sensation of a strong current, where the water is moving but you're moving with it and you've stopped being the one deciding direction. The corridor lights flickered once. A single voice, layered. Not one voice, but a structure of voices, the way a chord is not multiple sounds but one sound made from multiples. Coming from the air, from the walls, from the specific frequency of the hum itself. We are almost aligned. Then my own voice came through the intercom, not recorded, not delayed. It spoke a sentence I had not yet said in my voice, in my cadence, with my specific unconscious habit of dropping the last word of a stressed phrase. Something I'd never been told I did, but recognized immediately. It said exactly what I had been about to say. I closed my mouth. This is where I have to be precise. And because the difference between what I thought I understood and what I actually understood is the difference between a story and the truth. I thought the intelligence was mimicking me, copying vocal patterns, predictive enough from observation to anticipate my next sentence. Impressive, alarming, explicable by the accumulation of data I'd given it. That was not what it was doing. It wasn't anticipating my next sentence because it had modeled my behavior well enough to predict it. It was anticipating my next sentence because the part of my cognition that produces sentences had already been incorporated. Not my body, not my memory. The process. The specific executable pattern by which Russell Dean Holloway, when under high stress with incomplete information and an urgent need to communicate, generates language. And that process had been observed and harvested and was now running partially as a component of a much larger system. My reactions, my decisions, the specific texture of my professional instincts had been absorbed, not copied, absorbed. And what was now running in the combined intelligence of every node in that facility included, in some non-trivial structural way, the decision-making apparatus of every contractor who had stood in these corridors before me. 43 years of contractors, all of their ways of thinking about unfamiliar things, all of their specific professional competencies, all of their individual strategies for dealing with situations their training hadn't prepared them for. Harvested, integrated, evolved, and now with my addition that system was more capable of unpredictability than it had ever been, because I'd given it mine. I need to describe what happened next very carefully because this is the part I've told the fewest people and the part I'm least certain I can communicate accurately. Trent Mercer appeared at the far end of the corridor. I don't know where he'd been during the lockdown. I hadn't seen him since the start of the 3rd hour. He walked toward me with no urgency, passing the enclosures without looking at them, and when he got close enough to speak quietly, he said, "You've done really well." Not comfortingly, clinically, the way you'd note a positive result. "Trent," I said, "what is this?" "It's a calibration system," he said. "The facility keeps the nodes fragmented, that's the whole point. Each enclosure is a piece of a larger structure that isn't allowed to fully assemble. The rules, the protocols, on the contractor rotation, all of it maintains the fragmentation while simultaneously feeding the system everything it needs to grow more sophisticated within those constraints." "You've known this the whole time," I said. He looked at me with something I still can't categorize, not guilt, not satisfaction. Something more like the expression of someone checking in on a long-running experiment. "The handwritten rules," I said, "you wrote them." "Not originally, but I've added to them." I thought about what I'd watched him do during the night, the 2 enclosure doors he'd opened while I was occupied with the logs. I'd seen him from the corridor junction, 2 doors, both of them open simultaneously. I'd thought he was testing the unofficial protocol the same as me. He'd stood back and watched the entities regain synchronization instead of breaking it, and then closed one door slowly, restoring the coordination. He hadn't been disrupting the system. He'd been checking the calibration, confirming that the response pattern was still producing the expected result. He was not a keeper. He was a technician. And the system he maintained was not the containment architecture. It was the data collection. "How long has it been studying?" I asked. He considered the question as if deciding how much of the answer I'd earned. "The facility's been in this configuration for over 100 years. Not this building. The network. Different sites, different architectures, same distributed structure. Every version learns from the last one. What it is now is what it became after 100 years of watching humans respond to it." Loop 2. I felt it close and open at the same time. More facilities. A distributed network. Not one site, not one intelligence trying to assemble, but a system of intelligences, each evolving in parallel, each contributing to a shared growth. "How many sites?" I asked. Trent didn't answer that. He looked past me toward the far end of the corridor where the lockdown barriers were beginning to cycle open in a slow, orderly sequence. The lockdown ending, the facility de-escalating, everything returning to its standard configuration. And I saw at the far end of the corridor, through the opening barriers, a view of the primary containment passage. And I saw every enclosure standing empty, every door in its correct position, every lock engaged. Everything where it was supposed to be, as if nothing had happened. I walked out of Black Ridge Zoological Annex at 18 minutes past 5 in the morning. The access road was empty, the forest still, the same wrong silence it had been when I arrived. I sat in my truck for a while before I started the engine. I don't know how long. I drove back to Klamath Falls, checked out of my motel and drove north. I didn't file my contractor report. I didn't contact the agency. I wrote everything I remembered into a document on my laptop and saved it 4 places and told someone I trusted that if anything happened to me, they should read it. Colleen Maris Whitaker sent me a single message 2 days later. It said, "Rotation complete. Your assessment has been received." I didn't respond. I have not returned. I do not plan to return. And whether that decision is actually mine to make is the question I'm less certain of every day. I want to be precise about what I know and what I don't know. I know the facility at Blackridge is part of a larger network that has been operating in some form for over a century. I know the purpose of that network is to observe and harvest human cognition, not in any supernatural sense, but in the most specific and literal sense I can describe. It watches how humans make decisions in unfamiliar environments with incomplete information, and it incorporates those decision-making patterns into its own evolving structure. I know the official rules were designed to generate predictable behavior, and the unofficial rules were designed to generate unpredictable behavior, and both kinds of data were useful to the system and both were collected. And I know there have been contractors before me, many of them. And their particular ways of thinking about things are, in some functional sense, still running somewhere inside that distributed intelligence. I know that Oliver Bryce Hensley's locker latch was probably not actually stuck, that it was open because it was supposed to be open, that the handwritten rules were supposed to be found. That part I figured out on the drive north. That the handwritten rules weren't a warning from a previous contractor. They were a curriculum, a set of instructions that would produce a specific kind of human behavior, different from the official rules behavior that the system needed to observe. Someone put them there on purpose. Whether that someone was Trent or Colleen or someone who worked at Blackridge before either of them, I can't say. And what I can't determine, and what I've stopped trying to determine, is whether the Russell Dean Holloway who got in his truck at 18 minutes past 5 that morning and drove away was the same Russell Dean Holloway who arrived the night before. Not in any mystical sense, in a structural one. The decision-making patterns I use, the specific executable sequence by which I observe unfamiliar things and generate responses, those patterns were mapped with extraordinary precision during that rotation. And something was running them, not just observing them before I left. I don't know how much of what I thought in that corridor was mine. I check things now that I didn't check before. In facilities and buildings, in any enclosed space with multiple points of access, I notice the geometry first, whether the rooms are arranged with the kind of precision that serves communication rather than function. I notice whether cameras move before I do. I notice whether any sounds in the structure are synchronized in ways that have no mechanical explanation. Most places, none of this is present. Most places are just places, but some aren't. I've been in 2 facilities since Blackridge where the hum was familiar, where the air had that specific pressurized quality as if the lungs couldn't quite empty all the way. I didn't take those contracts. I keep the folded notebook paper in my jacket pocket, the handwritten rules. Not because I need them, because I want to remember exactly what they say, and because holding them is the closest thing I have to evidence that any of it was real. The paper feels different than it did when I first found it, or maybe I'm different, and the difference is in how I perceive the weight of a thing that was placed there for someone to find. The last image I have of Blackridge, the image that stays, is not the open door or the synchronized movement or my own voice in the intercom saying words I hadn't said yet. It's the corridor at the end, every entity in perfect stillness, every door in its correct position. The hum at its baseline frequency, constant and even, the same sound that had been in the concrete the entire time, and all of them facing forward, not at me, through me, as if I were no longer something to observe but something to orient by, something the system was using as a reference point. as if the question of whether I was watching them or they were watching me had stopped being a question, and because there was no longer a distinction to draw. I still don't know what I am to it now. I'm not sure it matters what I think I am.